scriptures, it was obvious to me that basically the reality was to not give him what was officially God's. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes in regards to praying to the saints, because people think that to honor someone is taking or usurping God's power or authority, which it's not. What I'm saying in regards to this call no man father bit is that you cannot specifically say as to a man, you are God. And that obviously is not good. All right, here's some scripture references just to check out in light of this. Acts 21:40, also Acts 22 verse 1, 1 Corinthians 4:14 and 15, Philemon 10, and 1 John 2:13 and 14. Now let's talk about that for just a few minutes in regards to kind of the intercessory prayers of the saints. This was probably a big one for me because I could not understand why or how their intercession was applicable once they passed into eternity. Now, sometimes people would say, well, it's just like you praying for a friend who asks you to pray for them. But I felt like, okay, that's not officially the same because we're dealing with people in time. We're existing in time. We're praying for people in time. This is not an outside of time event. And yet, I found kind of a little problem with this as I began to delve into the whole idea of intercessory prayer in regards to the saints, that the problem was, why, if it was a noble thing for us as humanity to pray for one another, if it was right and just for us to lift each other up, to come alongside, to encourage one another, to pray, then why was this somehow negated once we entered into eternity, especially since we were now face to face with Christ? In fact, we were the fullness of everything that we should be, so to speak. We in essence take on the reality of who we are in God's presence. And so, why would I all of a sudden forget and have no concern or care for those that are still on their journey? And that just didn't seem to make sense to me at all. And the more I studied, the more I found refuge that the saints who had passed before, they were cheering us on. And I think of that passage in Hebrews, the great cloud of witnesses. I believe it's like Hebrews 11 or 12. And I thought that was really kind of a beautiful picture, that, we're not running this alone, that people who have passed on before us are praying and cheering for us. They're there, watching us as we're participating in the struggles of our day-to-day lives. And that to me was comforting. Just a real brief thing in regards to purgatory. The concept of purgatory I had in my mind, but probably would not have ever named it that. And in a way, it wasn't completely defined, though, until entering into Catholicism, because I knew that there was a place in Scripture that talked about basically our poor works being burned, wood, hay, and stubble, that the bad would be just consumed by God's consuming fire, and that the good would be made manifest in precious stones and whatnot. Well, interestingly enough, that burning, that consuming fire, is a picture of purgatory. Now, whether or not that's minutes, seconds, or, a significant amount of time, really is not officially known that I know of. But it is there, and it is real. So it's kind of odd that is so problematic, because there are many scriptural references to check out. For example, Matthew 5:48, James 3:2, Hebrews 12:14, Matthew 5:26, Revelation 21:27, Matthew 12:32, 1 Corinthians 3:15, 2 Timothy 1:16-18, and 1 Peter 3:18-20, 1 Peter 4:6. These are probably just a few of the verses that a person could check out. There are also, obviously, books that you can investigate as well. Something else that was kind of interesting was the concept of confession. And for me, I was in the habit of trying to be as accountable as possible. In my Protestant upbringing, I would share with somebody, whether it was a person or somebody in leadership, kind of the things that I was struggling with. but they were just like me, so to speak. And the thing that in confession that was kind of exciting for me was the reality that God had given them a grace and ability to speak the forgiveness of God to us. Now, interestingly enough, in the Protestant background specifically that I was from, it was all cerebral. It was kind of just a mental exercise. You know, if I could finally convince myself that God would forgive me, then I could take another step. But seriously, it was a struggle for me many times, especially dealing with my past and some of the things and the choices, poor choices that I'd made. I did everything from, going back to all my high school teachers that I ever cheated from. I wrote them letters. I did as much restitution as a man could possibly do to try to find peace and specifically trying to believe the Scriptures and their forgiveness. But I honestly found that hearing a priest verbalize what is so dominant in Scripture regarding Christ's forgiveness was profound in my spiritual walk. I think that God gave us priests to do just that, to be a voice of His words, to be an authoritative, yes, you're forgiven. Yes, you screwed up, but yes, my blood has paid for those sins too. And I found that that was an incredible blessing for me. My first confession and entering into the Catholic faith was overwhelming. It was unbelievable. Matthew 9, 2 through 8. These are confession scriptural references. John 20, verse 23. John 20, verse 22. 2 Corinthians 5, 17 to 20. James 3:16, I believe. That might be 5:16, so forgive me for that. Matthew 18:18. Those are some that I think you'll find at least encouraging in your investigation in regards to confession. Concerning Bible alone and versus Bible and tradition, this to me was pretty answered in regards to the authoritative concept that really just seemed to make everything kind of fall in place for me, because when I realized that God had given us the authoritative magisterial teaching within the Catholic Church to have a definitive statement in regards to faith and morals, that we could have a consistency and a unity of thought, that made a lot of sense to me, because there was no specific canonization of scriptures, the New Testament, even really the Old Testament. Investigating that, you'll find that there was no definitive body canonical works regarding the Old Testament or New Testament until a wee bit into the early church. In fact, it wasn't finalized in terms of the New Testament canon specifically for quite some time. Now, I mention that because what did the early church do for those first few hundred centuries without a definitive, tangible book in which to, so to speak, base all of their traditions, all of their understandings of church? What did they do? And the reality came and comes with, they basically followed the reality of God's authority being spoken through His apostles. And this was traditionally seen for centuries and centuries and centuries, where there was a tangible church. We were able to know what to believe and how to practice. And there was no necessarily specific body of scriptures canonized at that time, and so when new topics arose, they dealt with it and they went through it. And so, for example, how did we come to the fullness of understanding the deity of Christ? Or how did we really specifically begin to define more and more the reality of the Trinity? They're definitely reflected and seen in scriptures, no doubt about it. But when you have people who are practically breathing down your neck, trying to change church histories and thoughts, and there's all sorts of new ideas, you need to have a definitive yes or a definitive no to battle heresy. And that was in the tradition that God had established, that authoritative body, the magisterial teaching of the church. Here's some references that you can check out. 1 Corinthians 11:2, 2 Thessalonians 2:15, 2 Thessalonians 3:6, John 21:25, Mark 13:31, Acts 20:35, 2 Timothy 1:13, 2 Timothy 2:2, Mark 16:15. And then regarding apostolic succession, I won't really